Two thumbs up. That's great. I want to thank Tanya for the opportunity to come up here and visit with your group. I don't visit with growers as often as I would like to, and so it's a real pleasure for me to be here. So unlike Mike, who talked before me, I didn't grow up on a family farm. My first job in agriculture was detasseling, and if you told a 13-year-old version of myself that you were going to end up in agriculture someday, after that first season of detasseling, I probably would have run for the hills. That was tough work, for sure. But I am involved in agriculture. I'm an entomologist by training, so obviously work with insects and have for a very long time, the better part of 20 years or so now. So that's kind of the area that I work in. I'm not an environmental toxicologist, so there's a lot of different kinds of insects. There are people that work with bees, people that work with all different aspects of entomology. My involvement in entomology is really on the pest management side. Okay, so within BASF, I have the role of a technical field representative for our seed treatment part of our business. Okay, so that really has two different elements to it. So the first part of my job, and the reason I got into it and the reason I love it, is that I put out a lot of research trials every year. Okay, I'm responsible for the research and development activities for BASF seed treatments or kind of the eastern corn belt, so east of the Mississippi River and north of Tennessee. So kind of that quarter of the country is where I operate in. The second half of my job is supporting our commercial sales folks with product training and also doing outreach activities like this, visiting with folks on any aspect of the BASF seed treatment portfolio. So what I'm here to do today is not to come up and really refute some of the points that Mike brought up earlier. Okay, there are a lot of studies there. A lot of those are related to that environmental fate, environmental toxicology. That's not an area that I do a lot of work in, and so I'm less familiar with some of those studies. And I certainly trust the work that he's doing in terms of the surveying that he's doing in the streams of Wisconsin. I know that's very important work. What my goal to do here is today is to really provide a sober assessment of what these neonicotinoids are, how they act as seed treatments, why they're used the way that they are used, and just so that we can understand kind of how we got here, okay? I also want to talk a little bit about their stewardship in ways and things that each and every one of us can do to make sure they're used in as safe a way as possible. I do want to correct a few misconceptions on the benefits of these things, as well as somewhat about how they're regulated. So we'll talk a little bit about that, because this is an area where we do get a lot of misconceptions out there. And finally, we'll talk about alternatives that are maybe coming down the pipeline and things that you can do if you don't want to use a neonicotinoid treated seed. So all that over the next 40 minutes or so. And I want to hope to leave around 10 minutes or so at the end for questions, because I think we can have some good discussion here, and maybe Mike can come back up as well. So without further ado, some of this will be redundant because I know Mike was talking about neonics in general as well, and so we have to kind of bring up some of the same things. But what we're talking about here when we talk about neonicotinoid seed treatments, we're talking about these group 4A, class 4A insecticides right here, okay? And in terms of which of these are used as seed treatments in our agricultural fields, really in the Midwest, we're really talking about just three of them: clothianidin, imidacloprid, and thiamethoxam. And it's actually closer to just two, because thiamethoxam itself, which you might know as the trade name Cruiser, is not actually insecticidal on its own. It actually has to break down into clothianidin in the plant or in the insect before it becomes insecticidally active. So there's really just imidacloprid, and clothianidin is kind of what we're talking about. Now, you'll notice, as Mike pointed out, that these are neonicotinoids, which sounds a lot like nicotine, okay? Nicotine obviously is a botanical insecticide that's been known about for a long time. These neonicotinoids are synthetic versions of that differ in some important ways, okay? And we'll talk about some of what those are here next. So what are the characteristics of these insecticides that I think are important to consider when we talk about why they're used as seed treatment? So these are these are a relatively new class of insecticides. I know it kind of makes me feel young when I say something from 1985 is new, because I was born not too long before that, but be it as it may, it is one of the newer classes of insecticides that we've got. Patented by Bayer in 1985, first commercialized really for use beginning in the 1990s, so relatively new. These things bind to these nicotinic acetylcholine receptors in the insect, okay? So that's a part of their central nervous system. And so when these neonicotinoids bind to those receptors, it essentially agonizes that nerve tissue, and you get constant firing. And that's how they essentially are able to kill insects when they come into contact with them. A couple of the characteristics about neonicotinoids in general, these typically have a broad spectrum of activity. And Mike brought this up as a potential detriment. And I think that's true if you're talking about their effects on non-targets. But if you think about that from a pest management standpoint, having a broad spectrum of activity can be beneficial if you're going against a number of different insects that are from different orders or different orders within that class. Now, another thing that was brought up to some degree was this notion that they have a high degree of systemicity. Okay, and what that means is that they are able to move around in plant tissue quite readily. A lot of this is related to water solubility. And there are other factors at play, but essentially what that means is when you treat that seed, much of it gets taken up into that plant, and therefore it can protect not just the seed from attack, but also the root system as well as the above ground foliage as well. So that, from a standpoint of using as a seed treatment, is a clear benefit. This was mentioned earlier as well. So the specificity for the insect nicotinic acetylcholine receptors is much greater for the neonicotinoids than for vertebrate. The same receptors we have in vertebrates, okay? This is not to say that these are perfectly safe for vertebrates, but it does mean that they have a more favorable mammalian toxicity profile. And this is important because a lot of those older classes of chemistry that we were using did not have this. And so when you think about as you're handling this seed, whether as an applicator, physically applying it to the seed, maybe loading it onto a truck or loading it into a planter, the amount that a human being is going to be exposed to is much safer than some of these older chemistries. And mentioning some of those older chemistries, neonicotinoids do represent a unique mode of action compared to some of these classes that we've used over the years. Things like carbamates, organophosphates, older classes of chemistry, and to a lesser degree, pyrethroids as well. So these were commercialized at a time, if you think about the 1980s into the 1990s, kind of the backdrop was that we were having resistance issues with some of these carbamates and organophosphates. And so the neonicotinoids did represent a new mode of action that could be accessed to affect pest control for some of these pest populations that were a little bit more difficult to control due to resistance. So that's some characteristics of the neonicotinoids. So in terms of adoption and use, these are three charts here, and maybe I didn't get the memo about not bringing a lot of charts. I actually got quite a few, so I hope you brought your reading glasses, and I'll walk you through these. Most of these I've highlighted the important points. But what we're looking at are three graphs. This first one on the left is the growth in the use of neonicotinoids in general in the United States, measured by how much we're being put out in these different uses. What we see is that there are a lot of different uses listed here, but the vast majority of these neonicotinoids were being used as crop chemicals. And you can kind of see this started, like I mentioned, around the 1990s, and it's continued on over time, not really having gone down post-2012 or so. In terms of which crops those are being used in, the predominant way that these things are used is as seed treatment. So it was mentioned earlier that there are root drenches, there are foliar use patterns, but predominantly we're using them as seed treatments. And this is mostly done in corn, soybean, some cotton, there's wheat as well, but predominantly that's kind of the way these things go out because of that systemic nature of these compounds. And again, in terms of the primary ones that are going out, again, there are a number of neonicotinoids. The primary ones, again, are imidacloprid, clothianidin, and dimethoxam. Okay, so that's kind of like how much of this we've used over the years. I do want to talk a little bit about adoption rates. I think it was mentioned earlier, but just some data to kind of show. Don't pay attention to the middle two graphs, okay? This is North Dakota specific, and I actually don't think I've ever stepped foot in North Dakota, so I can't really speak to that. What we're looking at here is the adoption rates of the use of neonicotinoid seed treatments, so percent treated, over a couple different scenarios. And if you just kind of follow that middle scenario, what you get is an estimate of the amount of corn seed and soybean seed that gets treated with a neonicotinoid insecticide. So for corn, this is at or very near 95%, something like that. There will always be some corn that doesn't get treated, that goes out. in a given season. There are specialty markets, okay, use on government lands, things like that, where maybe they're prohibited. So we're probably never going to get quite to 100%, but the overwhelming majority of corn is treated with a neonicotinoid insecticide. Now, soybeans is a little bit of a different story. So going back to somewhere around 2012, we were at around 45% or so. I would estimate, just on my personal experience in working with these products, that we're probably at that 50 to 55% of soybeans that goes out into a crop field gets treated with a neonicotinoid insecticide. So that's kind of the adoption rates for those two crops. Now, the other interesting thing from this paper, and all of these graphs and figures and things are from these sources, and I'm going to provide Tanya with a list of these so that they can be shared if you have any interest in looking these up on the back end. But there's a couple interesting things that happened around the time that neonics were commercialized that led to their rapid adoption in the way that we saw. So first, how many here remember growing corn in the early 1990s? Any of you grew corn in the early 1990s? Okay. Some of the big insect problems that we had were things like European corn borer. Okay, this was a major problem, problematic insect. And around 1996 or so, perhaps maybe it was 1998, we saw the introduction of BT hybrids, where you could plant a transgenic crop, and that would have a negative effect specifically on European corn borer, and allow you to grow that crop really without having to spray an insecticide for corn borer. Okay, that was a very familiar thing. Now, a few years after that, in corn, we saw the introduction of corn rootworm BT hybrids. Okay, so corn rootworm is the other major insect that we had in the United States. Anybody who grows continuous corn probably still deals with this insect today. But the predominant way that we were managing corn rootworm prior to the introduction of BT hybrids was through using soil insecticides. Okay, you put down a granular or a liquid in-furrow soil insecticides to manage your rootworm problem. Now, when we started using BT hybrids for corn rootworm, all of a sudden we really didn't need to use soil insecticides anymore. And so by not using that soil insecticide, many were afraid and found out that that corn crop would be susceptible to attack from other insects that were being incidentally controlled by that soil insecticide. And so that's why seed treatment started being used more and more in corn. It's because of that BT hybrid switchover for corn rootworm. Now, and what you see is a decrease in the use of soil insecticides, an increase in the use of BT hybrids, and probably a subsequent increase in the use of seed treatments. Okay, so that's the story for corn. For soybean, it's a little different. Prior to around the year 2000, there was really not a lot of insecticide going out in soybeans at all. We just didn't have a lot of insect pests that caused problems on a routine enough basis, and our management practices were such that we could tolerate a fair amount of yield or stand loss, and we really wouldn't worry too much about yield. Beginning in around the year 2000, we did have the introduction of a new insect pest into the soybean growing systems of the upper Midwest called the soybean aphid. Anybody here familiar with soybean aphids? Yeah, a couple here and there. Now, after this was introduced, we did have routine every other year outbreaks that likely necessitated spraying insecticides in soybeans to manage soybean aphids. Okay, so the paradigm shift when soybean aphid came over here. At the same time we were using seed treatments in corn, some found that when you use seed treatments in soybean, you saw a benefit against soybean aphid. And so that led to part of that adoption. Some other things happened kind of post-2010 that would lead to increased adoption of seed treatments in soybean as well. These would be things like maybe reducing seeding rates, okay? So when I started in agriculture, it wasn't uncommon to see soybeans go out at 160,000, 180,000 seeds per acre, right? And so you could lose 60 or 80,000 of those seeds and still probably be okay in terms of reaching your maximum yield.
Can everybody hear him? The microphone's dead.
Microphone's dead.
You can put the batteries in it though, if people are having
Switch on the bottom. Okay.
yeah.
Red light on?
Red light's on now. Well, it just turned off.
It's right there.
Probably dead.
Change it.
Okay, technical difficulty.
Sorry about that, guys.
I appreciate you guys nodding like you're hearing me, even though you may not. It is working. Maybe I just need to hold it closer? Okay. So a few of those things happened, and this precipitated the increase in adoption of seed treatments in these crops. Okay? Now, it was brought up earlier, this notion, I do work with growers sometimes, and I will occasionally ask them, what seed treatment are you using? And a lot of times I'll get the answer, well, I don't know, it's red. Okay, that's probably true. Red is the most common color that gets used in, I may just have to go without this. I don't know.
If people can hear, otherwise it's probably the batteries. I can swap the batteries on.
Okay, you work on that. And so a lot of people that are using seed treatments may not know what exactly is on their seed, right? And that's unfortunate. As somebody who works in seed treatment, it's nice to know that the products I'm working on people are aware of. But more importantly, the reason I put this up here is just to keep in mind that seed treatment insecticides are one small part of an overall seed treatment program. So most of the time on a modern day seed treatment, you'll have 3, 4, even 5 fungicidal active ingredients. In addition to the insecticide, you might also have a nematicide as well, in addition to any biological or inoculant that goes on that in addition to that. And so there's the insecticide part of this is important, and we are here to talk about that, but just keep that in context, that it's an overall larger program that typically goes out. And the one resource I will say that is really nice, this is actually put out by UW Extension. This is a What's on Your Seed tool where you can go onto this publication, and maybe you know that your seed is treated with something like Cruiser Max APX. You can look up exactly what's in that. And so if you're looking for something different for your particular operation, you can look through here and see which different products might be available. So great resource, and I'll share this as well if you're not aware of it. Okay, so with that being said, I do want to talk a little bit about what are the pest insects that we're going after with these seed treatments. This is a seed treatment label. This is Poncho 600. It's a product that BASF manufactures and markets. And I just want you to, and this is the corn section, okay? So typically what we're looking at here are a wide variety of insects. Remember, these are broad spectrum in nature. And so there's going to be pest insects on here like corn rootworms, which are beetles. You've got flies, so seed corn maggot occurs on here. We've also got things like thrips, grubs, so all different kinds of insects that might be threatening any one particular crop are going to be able to be controlled to some degree by a seed treatment insecticide. The other thing that's important to keep in mind here is that rate is important, okay? There are going to be some insects like thrips, for example, that are very easily controlled in corn, hardly ever a problem. You'd be using a very low rate for that. And then if you're using a seed treatment for something like corn rootworms, you need to recognize that that rate's going to be much higher. So not all corn receives a seed treatment at a maximum rate, right? Some receives it at a low rate, some receives it at a middle rate. And so that's important to keep in mind as well. So what are these insects and what do they have in common? Well, they have some things in common and other things they don't. Okay, so don't try and read this table here, okay? What I'm going to take you through is an interesting paper that was published in 2018 by Tom Sappington. He's a USDA scientist, kind of over in more of the plains states. And he got together with a lot of different entomologists that manage these insects and tried to pull together what are all these insects that we're going after, how common are they, and what are the risk factors? Because I think we know that these seed treatments are being used on a broad number of acres, and we try to want to have some understanding of what are the risk factors so that we can understand how to manage them better. So I just want to take you through a couple of examples here leading into kind of some overall general conclusions about these secondary or sporadic insect pests. So one of the things you'll notice here with bill bugs is that these things, in the Corn Belt, these are going to be very sporadic, very local, hardly ever a problem. But in certain areas of the United States, the Carolinas, this coastal plain, they're going to be common. This is one of the major pests that they have down there. So there are geographical differences that are important in these different insects. We've also got insects that appear on here that are migratory in nature, okay? So things that you couldn't scout for now if you wanted to. They wouldn't even arrive into Wisconsin until maybe May or later, okay? Now, those are the first couple. There's another couple here. One of the things you'll notice is the question is asked, is there a rescue treatment available? What's a rescue treatment? Well, that's if you see the insect, then you can affect a spray treatment kind of in response to that. What you'll find is that for some of these, especially these ones that are kind of subterranean in nature, there's really no rescue treatment available. For others, there definitely is. And so these things differ in that way, which can be important. The other thing to consider is that a lot of times it comes up that these have patchy distributions and that they're generally uncommon, but locally severe. So for example, you might have 9 out of 10 farmers not have an issue with something like wireworms, but one farmer might be severely locally affected. That is a problem with these types of insects. And I think the last one that gets mentioned is wireworms. But I just go through that table to show you how many there are. And as a pest guild, this is a really tricky group of insects to manage. If you think about all of them, they have a few things in common that they share. Okay, so number one, these things are generally sporadic. Okay, so they're not very common. That's why we call them secondary insect pests. But they can be locally severe. Many of them are going to have aggregated patterns of dispersion in the environment at both a macro level and at a local level. So you might say that the maybe Wisconsin experiences an outbreak of soybean aphids this year, right? That would be at the macro level. But then you could also have certain areas where that outbreak is especially severe. So you can have sporadic or patchy nature both in the big scale and in the small scale. These things can also be difficult to scout using traditional IPM. So this notion of traditional IPM gets brought up a lot, right? So as originally envisioned in 1959, IPM essentially came down to this. You have some pest population in a crop, you are able to count those insects, and at some point once you get so many insects, that's going to, spraying that insect to affect control is going to be equal to the cost of that spray. And so that's really when you would want to trigger that application, right? It's called the economic threshold. You've probably heard of this. And part of the reason to do that is so that you're not wasting money spraying an insecticide that you don't need to or using an insecticide you don't need to. But the other element of this is preserving non-targets in the environment. Things like ladybird beetles or lacewings, these have a pest control, biological control effect on those insects. And so you really only want to use those insecticides when they're justified. That's kind of the traditional scout and spray approach to IPM. Unfortunately, while this has been widely implemented in certain types of production systems, specifically things like vegetable production, high-value type crops, this has never really been broadly instituted in the type of commodity agriculture that we grow in the Midwestern United States, so corn, soybeans, things like that. There are exceptions, right? So soybean aphids is a great exception where you can actually count these insects and apply a foliar treatment in response to that. But many of the insects that we're talking about for secondary insect pests are subterranean in nature, okay? I'm an entomologist. I do a lot of graduate work in entomology. I've counted thousands of insects, if not hundreds of thousands of insects. And let me tell you, counting insects gets a lot harder when there's a shovel involved, okay? So some of these insects just aren't very suitable to being managed in this traditional approach. A lot of them are going to lack viable rescue treatment options, so anything underground, there's really nothing you can spray to get at that insect. So once you find out you have a problem, you basically have that problem. And the only recourse would be to tear up that field and replant if that would be economically justifiable. The other aspect of this is difficulty in scouting and timing some of these foliar rescue treatments that might be out there. So if you think about, again, just to use that example of soybean aphid, that's typically a problem. You might do that counting and that spraying in August. Probably not a lot going on that time of year, other than maybe going to some field days that companies are throwing for you. But these secondary insects, these things would need to be counted and scouted much earlier in the growing season at a time where you're also maybe finishing up planting operations on some of your fields, as well as maybe hustling to get herbicides applied. So there's some time conflict involved in that, as well as a labor commitment shortage in some of these communities. And finally, we've got poor information related to a lot of the economic thresholds for some of these insects. Many of the thresholds are older, okay, and so they may not reflect current commodity prices or other factors, prices of the compounds that would be used against them. And in addition to that, a particular problem with these insects is what you do when you have multiple species of insects that are pests, that none of which are above that economic threshold, but they all contribute to that overall pest load in that crop field. And so that's a really, really hard type of challenge to overcome. So what do we do for these types of insects? Well, what we typically do is adopt a more risk-based IPM, okay? So what we do as an individual grower is take stock of everything that might be going on that field from a production management standpoint, as well as just the overall environment and agronomics of that individual field. And once you start to check these boxes in terms of, yeah, this risk does exist, this risk does exist, then you start to gather some information you can use to make an intelligent management decision as to whether or not to use a seed treatment or some other management tactic. So I wanted to provide these for you. These are some good type of risk factors to consider if you're thinking about, do I need a seed treatment or not? These are some of the things you can think about. Number one, anytime you're planting in a field into pastured grassland or something coming out of conservation reserve, those are going to be really good situations to strongly consider using an insecticidal seed treatment. A lot of the insects that were talked about earlier are going to be long-lived. Okay, so you think about white grubs, wireworms, they go through these long life cycles, multiple years, right? And so they typically love these undisturbed areas. And so when you plant crops into these areas, you're more likely than not to experience insect problems. Planting into fields with a high level of organic matter that's decomposing. So think about maybe planting a field, a cover crop green, right? And then coming back and killing that cover crop. That's going to off-gas a lot of volatiles that are going to attract in things like seed corn maggots. So anytime you're using a cover crop, those sorts of things, they tend to attract in those seed corn maggots more than others. The same is also said for manure, which if you're in a livestock area, obviously can be important. Those are going to attract seed corn maggots. Planting a crop unusually late. So the example here is double crop soybean. This is way more common down where I'm from, where you'd harvest off the wheat sometime in June, and then you'd come in and plant a soybean crop. If you think about it, by the time that crop is planted, emerges, it could be maybe late June. And so all those insects have been awake and active for months. And so they tend to have more of an impact there. Planting a variety that's known to be susceptible to a disease that might be vectored by an insect. This is a little bit more specific. So for soybeans, this is maybe common in things like edible soybean production, things like edamame. So some of those varieties might be susceptible to things like bean pod mottle virus that gets vectored by bean leaf beetle. In corn, really any sweet corn or seed corn is likely to be more susceptible to Stewart's wilt, which is a disease that gets transmitted by flea beetles. So some of those specialty type situations put you at an increased risk and maybe necessitate using something like a seed treatment. And finally, planting with reduced seeding rates, and I tend to call this anything lower than 140,000 seeds. Although, I think, if you think about in soybean, you can probably get your, that crop down. If every single seed comes up and you had 100,000 seeds, you're going to max out that yield. The problem is a lot of these insects are causing stand loss in a way that's patchy, and so it may necessitate, you may have most of the field okay with 130,000 plants per acre, but then some of that area is significantly lower. So anyway, that's a risk factor as well. Okay. Now, I want to. One of the things that gets brought up a lot is that these neonicotinoids don't provide a benefit to growers, okay, that use them. And I think there's a number of different ways to think about this, and so I'm going to go through some different examples of how to think about this. But I do want to be very clear on one thing. These are defensive compounds, okay? When you think about all seed treatments, so think about an inoculant, for example. If you plant a soybean field and you use an inoculant, that's kind of an offensive tactic, right? You're increasing the yield by one of those practices that you're doing. When you use an insecticide, you're preventing yield loss. And so the wrong way to think about it is, well, I used a neonicotinoid insecticide and I'm going to get a 2-bushel bunch, right? That is a bad way of looking at it. What you're looking about is what is likely that I'm protecting yield loss when I use these insecticides. So from the outset, these things are very effective as insecticides. This is a trial conducted last year, replicated, small plot research, looking at a few different neonicotinoid insecticides compared to this fungicide check. And essentially what you're looking at is a photograph taken looking down at the row. This is a seed corn maggot trial, very heavy pressure, doesn't occur in all fields. But what you can see is that in general, these neonicotinoids preserve stand pretty significantly compared to that fungicide check, some more so than others. This is, again, one trial just to kind of show that, against these seed-feeding insects, these neonicotinoids are having a huge impact. Now, what about pests that feed above ground? So this is also a trial from last year. This was conducted in Nebraska. This was targeting bean leaf beetles. And so these are insects that come out right out of the gate and start to feed on things like alfalfa that might be out in the landscape. And as soon as soybeans start to emerge, they'll move to that soybean crop, and then they'll go through a few generations. Now, I put this in here just to recognize that. So what we're looking at is the percentage of plants that have feeding injury, right? For the fungicide check, somewhere around 50-55%. all of the insecticides used in this trial significantly reduced the amount of plants that had feeding injury. And this is 37 days after that soybean crop was planted. So again, even for these above ground foliage feeders, we're still getting a significant, statistically significant effect in terms of control using these neonicotinoid seed treatments. Another example is the soybean aphid. I actually don't work on this insect as much anymore because it's less and less common. But here's an insect that we typically think about, again, is coming in late in the season. And this is actually, these are results from my master's project where we were looking at using a commercial variety compared to a commercial variety with thiamethoxam, which is one of those neonicotinoid seed treatments. And what we can see, when we're looking at cumulative aphid days, so total exposure of that crop to aphids, okay? That's an important way to look at this. What we see is a significant reduction in the amount of exposure in 2007, not quite statistically significant, but still quite large in 2008. In terms of the yield, right, so some of these are not statistically significant, but what we do see is on average a trend of a positive yield improvement, even against this insect that comes in much later in the year. And this is anywhere from 3 to 6 bushels in this particular pair of trials. Now, you can argue about statistical significance and biological significance and farmer relevance all day long, but when you're talking about gaining back 3 to 6 bushels when treating for soybean aphids using a seed treatment, what you're talking about is a return on investment that is quite high, upwards of 10 to 1 return on investment from a strictly economic standpoint against these pests, not to talk about any of the other effects. Now, one of the next ones I'll show you before we kind of move on to something else that's maybe a little less graph intensive is corn rootworm. So just pay attention to this top left-hand graph right here. Sometimes we'll often get asked, well, there's a very small amount of this seed treatment that's applied. It can't be very effective for something like corn rootworm. And this is a project that I did for my PhD where we're looking at the total amount of injury that is occurring on fungicide only and how it relates to the total amount of injury occurring on seed that was treated with a neonicotinoid seed treatment. And essentially what we found is this relationship, that the using of a seed treatment will reduce the amount of injury by about 50%, okay? So that's quite a bit reduction considering that this seed might be planted in maybe late April, and those eggs aren't even hatching until mid-May, and 50% hatch really doesn't even occur until around Memorial Day. So again, what we're getting is long-lasting control. The benefits are clear when the insects are in the field. Now, another way to get at the benefits of this is what do farmers say the benefits are? So this is a study put out by an economist actually at UW-Madison, Paul Mitchell and his colleague, looking at basically doing a survey saying, you, Mr. Grower, and I think they surveyed a few hundred growers, hey, what is the value of this seed treatment when you use it? And these are basically their responses to that. What they found, and ignore all these bars with cotton, those folks are weird down there. Well, I shouldn't say that. The insect problems they have in the South are quite different than the ones up here, so I tend to ignore data related to that. But essentially what they found was that for corn, this bar right here, what growers said was that I value that as somewhere around 18.75 per acre. For soybean, it was a little less, something like 14.25 per acre. So again, growers, I think, see the value when they use these, and they're incorporating a lot of different elements into that value, right? Things like if I use this seed treatment, then maybe I'm covered on replant protection, or I just don't like messing around with it, and so therefore there's some value in that. And also, growers tend to overestimate the value of something that they're using, maybe to self-justify why I'm using it. So while these values are maybe impressive, they tend to, I think, maybe be a little overinflated. There's another way to look at it, and so all the trials that I pointed out earlier were insect trials. So they were all focused on using fields where we knew that we were going to have insect problems. The reason for that is because we're trying to develop insecticides. So I need pest pressure to know if those pesticides work or not. Another way you can do this is to put out more broad acre type of trials. I want to make sure we're doing good on time. I think we are. The other way to do this is put out more broad acre trials. Okay, so what we're looking at here, actually this study was brought up earlier by Mike. This was a study kind of spearheaded out of UW through an agronomist there, Sean Conley. But it involved agronomists from all over kind of the Midwestern Corn Belt, okay? And I think overall there were something like 190 sites used for this, so a lot of data went into this. Now, there's a lot of different ways that this was analyzed in the paper. They looked at a number of different factors. So what are the factors that made soybean yield responsive? When did I get high yields? When did I get low yields? What happens when I interacted those with the different seed treatments that were being used? But if you just look at overall, on average, across all of those trials, essentially what was found was that, and I'm comparing these two bars here because what we've got here is the fungicide-only seed treatment, okay? It yielded this amount, and the fungicide-only plus the neonicotinoid seed treatment yielded this amount. I think the difference in the paper was something like 0.04 megagrams per hectare, okay, which I had to do some conversion on that. That was around 0.6 bushels per acre. Now, that's not a ton. It was statistically significant in the case of these trials. And I think what's important to recognize about that is even though it's not 2, 3, 4 bushels per acre, that 0.6 bushels per acre, if you think about a commodity price for soybean of something around $10, so that 0.6 bushel benefit would be something around $6, that's probably in line with what one of these insecticides might cost. And so the overall conclusion of this paper could have been that neonicotinoid seed treatments significantly improved yield compared to fungicide only, and did so at a rate that was commensurate with the economic injury level for those insects in that field. Now, again, this is really hard because there are some fields in here where no benefit would have been observed or even a negative benefit, and other fields that were analyzed where a positive benefit surely would have been encumbered. And so it really is not a great way to look at it, even though it maybe supports this notion that these are being used on the broad scale in a justifiable way. Because again, it's an individual decision in that specific grower's field that makes the difference here, or how they should be considered anyway. Okay, so moving on. I do want to talk a little bit about how are neonicotinoid seed treatments regulated, because sometimes I do get asked, hey, are these things regulated? I hear they're not regulated. What's going on with that? And as Mike did a great job of pointing out, all pesticides, including neonicotinoid seed treatments, are regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. Just like any herbicide, fungicide, insecticide that you're using, seed treatments fall in that category. Where it gets a little different, and Mike mentioned this, is this treated article exemption. So what this means is that the seed is not registered with the EPA. Okay, so this is the same thing as like railroad ties that are treated with a termite agent or other type of thing. You don't actually register the seed with the EPA. That would be regulatorily onerous. But that's not to say that they're not regulated. Has anybody here ever got a bag of seed and noticed that there's this big long tag on it? It's about a foot long, something like that. Okay, so this is called a bag tag. These articles that are exempted under this clause still have their own different, unique labeling characteristics and requirements. So what you'll see on there is all the different things. So, right, it's going to identify what that insecticide is. It's going to say what you can use it for. It's going to say things like what you can wear while you're handling it. All of the things that are on that pesticide label occur on that bag tag. So I think to say that they're not regulated and stewarded in some way, I think is a little bit misleading, but certainly differently than the actual chemistry itself. Now, how many of you have read one of these bag tags? Okay, I got one guy. Yeah, you're supposed to read those. Yeah, give those a read sometime. The reality is I think a lot of us are busy in the spring and we don't spend a lot of time reading those. One thing I will say is that these insecticides, when they go out in a crop field, should go out in a specific way. How you put them out kind of matters. And so I would encourage you to read those bag tags. One of the things we do at BASF is try to drive an awareness campaign every single year around this time of the year into May. It's called the Be Sure campaign, and it really talks about the best management practices that you can use when you're handling, planting treated seed. And I pulled out the section of this kind of pamphlet that we put together, which I'll provide to the group. And this is things to consider when you're planting neonicotinoid treated seed, because there are ways you can plant this that are better than others, okay? Assuming that you're going to use it. So, number one, all of these different seed treatment products have a recommended crop a seed depth associated with them. That, you might be surprised to hear that. That's going to be indicated on that bag tag, okay? And that depth, how deep that seed is planted, is going to have some implications for how that might move around into non-target areas, all right? And that depth goes into the calculations related to the environmental risk assessment performed by the regulatory agencies like EPA. So it is important to plant these things at the depth. Maybe it's a half an inch for soybean, maybe it's 1.25 inches for corn, but you should know what those are. The other thing is, obviously, follow the directions by your equipment manufacturers for your planter. I mean, I think they're all probably doing this. This feels maybe silly to mention, other than to say that sometimes in the spring we do get a little carried away. Maybe we go too quick. Maybe we don't get quite the right settings that we need, and so it's just important to dial those in. The other thing you might be able to do is to take care to reduce and control dust emissions. Okay, so I think the biggest risk from a non-target or off-target exposure with neonics is around dust. So just to set the stage, when you use a seed that's been treated with a neonicotinoid, the odds are substantial. It's nearly 100% in corn and maybe not quite high in soybean, that seed is also treated with something called a polymer. So what is a polymer? Well, it has two jobs. One is to help that seed move through the planter in a way that reduces skips and doubles, improves singulation. So that's kind of the farmer benefit. The other job of that polymer is to kind of lock that active ingredient on the seed as best it can so that much of that seed doesn't get abraded off during that planting and loading process. So that polymer already comes on there, but there are some things that you can definitely do. So one of the things that we notice with our vacuum or pneumatic type planters is that there's a fan, right? And that fan is going to generate air pressure that holds the seed where it needs to be as it gets planted. Well, that vacuum fan is going to have exhaust ports on it. And so typically that will just be kind of, that dust that will come off of that will just kind of move in the local environment. They do make deflectors for those, where you can direct that dust back down toward the soil. It's not going to be perfect, right? But that is going to reduce the amount of dust that might move into, let's say, a neighboring stream or something like that. So those dust deflectors are available and can be purchased for use. Using high-quality dust-free seed, right? So this mostly applies to wheat in the treating process. I will say I've seen some dusty soybean over the past year or so that I didn't like to see. But again, that's kind of handled by that retailer or applicator. Using the appropriate seed flow lubricant. So how many of us here maybe use talc or graphite when we're planting? A couple guys? Yeah, that's great. You know, I think we do need something to help with that seed moving through the planter. I'd say measure it out, right? I know a lot of guys that typically will just say, well, maybe a little more, right? Use the amount that you're supposed to use, right? Those products are inherently very dusty, and so you don't want extra dust out there if you can avoid it. Some of that dust might get captured, some of these neonicotinoids in that process. Now, one of the things you might be interested in if you need to use a neonicotinoid and you want to reduce this dust as much as possible, they do make advanced seed flow lubricants, okay? So when I was previously with Bayer Crop Science, we had a product called Fluency Agent. And this was available for purchase. It was a 100% polyethylene wax. So it wasn't very dusty like talc. It was powdery, but there was no dust involved, and so it really reduced the amount of dust that was coming off of that planter. I don't know if that's still available. I no longer work with Bayer, obviously, but polymer or seed fluency agents like that do exist, and you're going to look for the wax-based ones. Okay, and I'm not even going to do this last one. This is just cleaning up spilled seed. I don't know who wouldn't clean up spilled seed. It represents a huge investment on our farms in any given year, and so it's important that we take care of it. Okay, so finally, we're good on time. We have plenty of time that we can have a conversation after this, which I think will be really good. So, what alternatives exist to using neonicotinoid seed treatments? Okay, so as I see it, there are a few things you can do. There is no law that says you have to use a neonicotinoid seed treatment on your crop. Okay, it doesn't exist. There's no mandate for this. Now, I will say that sometimes it's going to add some complexity to your operation if you do not want to include that, and it's going to involve some flexibility. So, number one, it's going to depend on your individual level of risk tolerance. If you're someone who says, you know, I don't want to use a neonicotinoid, and I don't mind maybe losing a field or replanting a field, you know, everyone's risk tolerance is going to depend there. Number two is your ability to actually scout and apply a rescue treatment. Okay, so if you're a farmer, you know, I know a lot of farmers who maybe have the local retailer contract out to spray their fields. Maybe you're a farmer that owns your own sprayer, and you can get a jug of some alternative chemistry to respond to maybe a bean leaf beetle outbreak or a black cutworm outbreak. Then that's one potential thing that you can consider. Again, willingness to replant fields or pest-affected areas of fields. That always comes with some risk, right? If you plant a field in April, discover that a quarter of it is having stand issues that are economic and level, and maybe you can replant that in maybe mid-May, late May. There's going to be some yield loss there, but if you're willing to replant that field and accept that risk, you can certainly do that. And on the whole of the farm, maybe that's the better choice for your particular level of risk. In early communication with your seed provider, keep in mind that when you want to use untreated seed, or seed not treated with an insecticide anyway, you do fall into kind of an exceptional category, right? And so it's important to think about when this seed is treated to understand when you could order it, right? So soybeans, for example, are typically treated starting around right now, once it warms up, and then continuing for the next 2 months or so, okay? So you could potentially make that decision about using non-insecticide treated seed about right now, potentially. Corn, on the other hand, the process with corn is a little different in that, as far as, and I'm not a seed company, I don't, have anything to do with selling corn or anything like that, but my understanding is essentially, once that seed corn field is harvested, it will go directly to either a seed company facility or a tolling facility, where it will be dried down and then sorted and graded, and then almost immediately after that is when some of these seed treatments start to be getting applied. Because that demand in the market is at that 95% level. So what you need to recognize is that if you want to use untreated corn seed, you need to start having that communication significantly earlier, right? So, I access untreated corn seed every single year for trials that I put out. That's how I can do my job. And I start having those conversations usually sometime around July or August. So it needs to happen much earlier in that cycle, and likely a smaller seed company is going to be a better way to go for that type of a situation. But let's say you're interested in using the insecticide, but you're just concerned about neonicotinoids. So a huge part of my research portfolio in any given year. So of the 130 trials that I put out, fully 2/3 or more are kind of early phase development work, and of those, the vast majority is in insecticides. We as an industry are desperately trying to come up with new alternatives, right? That growers can use and have access to, that maybe avoid some of the risks that do exist when we use more traditional chemistries like neonicotinoids. And so what I can say is that over the years, I've seen a lot of candidate compounds come and go. It is very hard to develop a new product because essentially what you want it to do is work the same way as the neonics, but just without maybe having such an effect on bees that come into contact with it and those sort of things. And that's a very hard needle to thread. There's been a number of years where I've been given a trial, I've got the seed, I've had it planted, and then by the time that trial was even evaluated for corn rootworm, for example, that candidate was already canceled because it failed some toxicology screen, okay? That happens every year all the time. And so what I can say is there are some new insecticides that are out there, and so these are typically going to fall into this kind of new mode of action. These group 28s, these are the diamides. So the predominant ones used in crops would be cyantraniliprole and chlorantraniliprole or tetraniliprole. So that's a new class of insecticide that's out there, as well as this metadiamides, these group 30s. Okay, so for example, broflanilide is the one that BASF manufactures and markets. So there's a couple things to consider with these new insecticides, though. Less commonly available. So, for example, broflanilide as a seed treatment is really only available in wheat at the moment. There's really no label on corn or soybean, so not a good substitute. Some of these other ones, for example, cyantraniliprole, chlorantraniliprole, these are things that may not be available to every retailer or to every seed company, and so it can be hard to know what might be available to you. I do know that at least one of those two is available from a major seed company in the United States, so that is a potential thing to access. these things, as new insecticides, right, they were developed by a company who spent money on it. They potentially are going to be more expensive than some of the neonicotinoids. A lot of the neonics that are out there are kind of in that post-patent time, right? So some of them are accessible as generic, making them very cost-effective. And so some of these newer insecticides may be more expensive. And they also may have a different spectrum or level of activity. So for example, broflanilate, very good on wireworms, corn rootworms, things like that, but really not systemic. And so it doesn't affect things like aphids or bean leaf beetles if you were to use it on soybean. And so you have this situation where these can serve as replacements, but not necessarily for all pests in all cases. Okay. That's all I got. I just wanted to close just kind of thanking you guys for the opportunity to come up here and really visit with you a little bit more about neonics, try to correct some misconceptions that are out there without kind of negating the need that we do need to be concerned anytime we use these products in our environments. And I think maybe we got time for questions, 5 minutes, something like that. So, yeah.
Do you have any results from studies of crop rotation and levels of insecticide use?
Yeah, so what type of insecticides are we using in crop rotated areas? Yeah.
But more than just corn and beans. I mean,
Yeah. That's a good question. Here's one thing I'll say from the outset is especially in corn, the insect research and that sort of thing has been so dominated for so long by a few major insects that we just don't have a lot of research on some of these secondary insect pests. I suspect that, and based on some things that I read in some of those papers, that these specific crop rotations can be very important. So for example, grape colaspis is a small beetle that produces small grubs that can be a problem in soybeans under the right conditions. And when grown after a clover cover crop, it's particularly risky for having that. So some of this information does exist. The papers I'll share with Tanya, I'll include the 3 papers that Tom Savington was a part of. So there's one for corn that goes through all those insects, one for soybean, I think one for wheat, and maybe another one. And if you were to go through those, you might be able to become the expert on, okay, this is how I need to manage this for that reason. It's a great question. Yeah, so we got 2 right next to each other.
Do you agree with Mike that only 10% of the neonic is taken up by the plants?
Yeah, I would have to look at that in more detail, that specific study, and potentially also visit with some of our physiochemical folks in BASF. Again, I'm an applied entomologist, and I haven't necessarily read that specific study.
And a follow-up to that, he also said a 7-year shelf life, if you will. Does that mean we have residual neonics in the soil?
Yeah, again, that would be one I need to look at. That feels like a long time. These things, all the different, even different neonic insecticides are going to have different half-lives. Yeah, I don't want to speak to that without having looked into that paper. It does feel long to me, but yeah. Yeah, in the back.
So we have CRISPR technologies to create transgenic linkers in the genes of our crops. Is one of the alternatives that we could see in the near or distant future to see treatments be some more traits being moved around in the genes of our major crops to tackle some of these major pests, in addition to like the diamides as alternatives?
Yeah, I hope so. Okay. I do work for BASF. I'm an entomologist, but I think that anytime we can affect pest control that is maybe more sustainable than the previous way we were doing it, and I don't think that the neonics are necessarily causing adverse harm, at least in the cropping environment. This issue of water and some of the sort of that's a separate issue that I'm not familiar with. Yeah, I sure hope that we get to a point where you could put 20 different traits in a crop plant to knock out only pest insects that are feeding on it. I'd love that. We had tremendous success with corn rootworm and BT corn, as well as European corn borer and BT corn. It's not perfect, right? Resistance issues. We're starting to see more of those. Very expensive to develop. Takes a lot of time. But I do have faith in technology and our advancement in that area. Yeah. Couldn't estimate what the time frame on that was. This gentleman had his hand up.
I'll pose the same question to you as I did to Mike about the idea that insects are unable to metabolize plants that have higher sugar concentrations.
Yeah.
Is that something you guys are aware of?
I should have gone on my phone after I heard you ask that question in case you had the follow-up. I'm not familiar with that, but I will write that down.
No, I just assumed as a or as an insect entomologist that would seems to be one of those things that just how the digestive system of a insect works, that the sugar levels would affect it.
Yeah, there are entomologists who spend their entire career looking at the different way the insect tibia is formed. Point being, there's a lot to entomology. I'm gonna.
No,
I do think that's interesting. I'm not.
No. I just being in the field more than where Mike would have been might have been something you ran across. But so you're not aware of that idea at all.
That most sugar type applications I've been familiar with are more about like infra application for kind of spiking microbial activity and generating nutrients for the plant in that way. But that's an interesting.
Okay.
You could look to sugarcane to find out some information about that. Yeah, that's a good.
Yeah.
You mentioned a 50% decrease in corn rootworm feeding. Do you know what rate that was?
Yeah, so that particular paper, the only way a seed treatment was included in that was when it was at the labeled rate, and that labeled rate is the same for all of them. It's 1.25, 1250 is what it was. Now, so what I'll say with that is, and that's kind of across levels of pressure, right? So let's say that the potential injury is 0.25 nodes, right? That injury on the seed treatment is going to be 0.125, right? So that huge yield benefit I mentioned is really at that upper end of the scale, but it's a good question.
Yeah, one more.
Yeah, I think we got time. Whatever you need, yeah.
Are we raising sandhill cranes with nicotine habits? Because
yeah, interesting question. I don't know what their exposure level is. I do know that they consume seed that they find on the ground, right?
Absolutely.
I know that
even in the ground.
Yeah, and I know folks that will put out seed that's been treated not with insecticides but with a repellent, right? To kind of remove that issue if it's important in some way. I hope not, if that's the case, but yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you all for your attention.